It stands on a hillside above the Dartmouth shore, looking out across the harbor toward Halifax. Victorian brick, long corridors, tall windows that catch the morning light off the water. From a distance, it could be a school, or a civic hall, or the kind of institution a prosperous young province builds to announce that it has arrived. The grounds are green. The harbor behind it is beautiful. The building commands the hillside with the quiet authority of something that has been there a very long time and intends to remain. But this is not a story about civic pride. Between 1858 and the closing decades of the 20th century, within these walls, the province of Nova Scotia confined thousands of human beings. Not all of them ill, not all of them dangerous, not all of them there by any meaningful choice of their own. This was the Nova Scotia Hospital, built as a monument to compassionate reform, transformed over generations into a machine for making inconvenient people disappear. If you're drawn to the histories that institutions prefer you never find, you're welcome to subscribe and keep exploring with me. To understand what the Nova Scotia Hospital became, you must first understand the world that built it. In the mid-19th century, Nova Scotia was a young province of the British Empire, ambitious, prosperous by Atlantic standards, and deeply invested in the project of appearing civilized. Halifax was a garrison city. The province's economy ran on fish and timber and the labor of those who had no other options. The Mi'kmaq, whose land this had been for millennia, were being pushed toward the margins of everything, landless, legally voiceless, and largely invisible to the institutions of the colonial state. For those deemed unable to function in this economy, the poor, the mentally ill, the disabled, the aged and destitute, there were limited options. There were jails, there were poorhouses, there were the back rooms of family homes where the unmanageable were kept out of sight. There were, in the worst cases, outdoor confinement in sheds and cellars, reported by neighbors with a mixture of shame and resignation. In 1848, an American reformer named Dorothea Dix arrived in Nova Scotia. She had already transformed the landscape of psychiatric care in the United States, moving from state to state, documenting the conditions in which the mentally ill were being kept, and presenting those findings to legislatures in language so specific and so damning that it was almost impossible to ignore. What she found in Nova Scotia was consistent with everything she had found elsewhere. Human beings kept in conditions that would have troubled a farmer using them for livestock. She presented her findings to the Nova Scotia legislature. She described what she had seen in specific detail: the chains, the filth, the darkness, the despair. She described the suffering of those who had no advocate, no voice, no mechanism by which the world could even know they existed. The legislature listened. And in the years that followed, the province did what reformers across North America were doing. It decided to build something better. The ideology behind that decision was called moral therapy. It was, in its origins, a genuine humanitarian impulse. The theory, developed in England and France in the early 19th century and championed throughout North America by Dix and her peers, held that mental illness could be treated, not just managed, but genuinely healed through the right environment. Clean air, productive work, structured routine, human dignity, remove the sufferer from the chaos and degradation of their circumstances, place them in a calm and ordered setting, and the mind could restore itself. It was a theory built on compassion. It produced, when properly resourced and genuinely applied, remarkable results. It represented the most progressive thinking about mental illness that medicine had yet produced. And it would be used, over the following century, to justify some of the most sustained and systematic abuse in Canadian history. The province of Nova Scotia passed the necessary legislation. Land was acquired on a hillside in Dartmouth. Plans were drawn. Funds were allocated. Politicians gave speeches about the duty of a civilized society to its most vulnerable members. The Nova Scotia Hospital for the Insane opened on the 1st of June, 1858. The harbor was beautiful that morning. The patients who arrived first could see Halifax across the water. None of them knew that the building that opened to receive them would, within a single generation, become something its founders never mentioned in their speeches. The man most responsible for what the Nova Scotia Hospital became in its first decades was not the politician who championed the legislation, nor the reformer who argued for its necessity before the legislature. It was the province's first medical superintendent, the physician, appointed to give the new institution its shape, its philosophy, and its daily character. He arrived in 1858 with impeccable credentials for the moment. He had trained in Britain, he had read the literature, he believed in moral therapy, in the healing power of order and purpose, in the idea that the right environment could restore a disordered mind. He was, by the standards of his era, a progressive. He designed the hospital's early routines. Patients worked on the farm, they tended the grounds, they attended chapel, they ate in a communal dining hall. The hospital was intended to function as a self-sustaining community, a world within a world, sheltered, ordered, productive. He wrote regular reports to the provincial government, documenting the population, the treatments, the recoveries. He used the language of medicine and reform, of progress and civilization. He described the hospital as an instrument of healing. What he did not write about, what did not appear in the annual reports submitted to Halifax, was what happened to the patients who did not recover, what happened to those who arrived, not because they were mentally ill, but because they were poor or troublesome or in someone else's way. What happened to those who arrived with no one waiting for them on the outside? He was a man of his era, and his era had a very specific view of who deserved to be put away. Within the first 2 decades of the hospital's operation, the gap between the institution's stated purpose and its actual function had already begun to appear in the record. Patients were being committed on the testimony of a single physician, often a family physician who knew the patient only slightly, or not at all. The legal standard for commitment was broad enough to encompass virtually any behavior that a husband, a father, or a local magistrate found inconvenient. Women were committed for what was documented as domestic excitement, a term that covered everything from genuine psychosis to the act of refusing a husband's authority. Men were committed for drinking, for vagrancy, for the inability to hold employment. The founding medical superintendent processed these commitments and filed these patients into the institution's wards. He did not question the referrals that came to him. He did not investigate the circumstances of admission. He received them, assigned them beds, documented their diagnoses, and added their names to the rolls. He was never investigated for this. He was never reprimanded. He served his full tenure and retired with the province's gratitude. He was the first in a line of men who held absolute authority over hundreds of human lives, who used that authority in ways that were known and documented, and who faced no consequences for what they did with it. There is a moment in the early history of the Nova Scotia Hospital that the official record preserves, almost accidentally, in a note written by one of its earliest patients. She was a woman in her 40s. She had arrived in the hospital's first year of operation, committed by her husband for what was recorded as melancholy. The note she wrote, somehow preserved in the provincial archives, described the view from her ward window. She described the harbor, the light on the water in the late afternoon, the distant buildings of Halifax, visible through the glass. She described sitting at that window for hours, watching the light change, thinking about her children. She wrote, "The water is so close. I have looked at it every day for 3 years. I do not know why I cannot go home." She did not go home. The record of when she died, or what happened to her, ends there, in that note. The province was very proud of what it had built. The Nova Scotia Hospital was not a palace. It was not designed to dazzle, but it was designed to make a statement about what a modern, humane province looked like when it took its responsibilities seriously. The original building sat on elevated ground above the Dartmouth shore, the site chosen deliberately, as moral therapy required. Fresh air, a view of the water, distance from the noise and disorder of the city. The Victorian brick facade was long and symmetrical, with tall windows that let in light across the length of the main ward corridors. There was a quality to the building that read, from the outside, as dignified. It was meant to. The farm occupied the land behind the main building. Vegetable gardens, animals, pasture land. This was not incidental. In the moral therapy model, the farm was therapeutic. Patients who worked the land were engaged in purposeful, restorative labor. They were participating in the life of the institution. They were, in theory, healing through usefulness. The chapel stood at one end of the main building. Sunday services were attended by all patients capable of attending. The communal dining hall was designed for order and routine. The same meals, at the same times, every day. Predictability was medicine. Structure was cure. The wards were divided by sex and, gradually, by severity of condition. The upper floors housed those who were calmer, more compliant, more capable of routine. The lower wards housed those who were not. The distinction between floors was noted in the annual reports. What was not noted was what the lower wards actually looked like, or smelled like, or sounded like at night. At the back of the hospital grounds, mostly out of sight from the main building and from the road, was a patch of ground that did not appear on the official maps distributed to visitors or legislators. The soil was soft there. The markers, when they existed at all, were wooden stakes. They bore numbers, not names. The hospital's founders called the grounds therapeutic. The patients who worked those grounds knew there was a section they were never allowed to approach. One detail appears in the earliest architectural descriptions of the building and is worth preserving here, because it will mean something different by the time this story is over. In the planning documents for the hospital, the architects made particular note of the upper floor windows on the eastern face of the main building. The windows were positioned and sized specifically to take advantage of the view across the Dartmouth Harbor toward Halifax. The founders believed, and recorded this belief, that the sight of the city across the water would inspire patients with the promise of return. The harbor view was, in their language, part of the cure. They could not know that for many of the people who would stand at those windows over the following century and a half, Halifax would never be anything but a reminder of the life being held just out of reach. In its earliest years, the Nova Scotia Hospital functioned approximately as its founders had intended. The patient population in the first decade was manageable. The farm produced food. The wards were not yet overcrowded. There were genuine recoveries. Patients who arrived in states of acute crisis and, given rest and structure and distance from whatever had overwhelmed them, improved enough to return to their families and their lives. The medical superintendent documented these recoveries in his annual reports with evident satisfaction. They were proof of the model. The province sent its legislators to visit. There were tours. The hospital was, in these early years, a point of provincial pride, evidence that Nova Scotia was a modern society, a compassionate one, a place that did not leave its most vulnerable citizens to suffer in jails and poorhouses. In the mornings, the harbor was often covered in a thin mist that burned off by mid-morning. Patients who worked the farm rose early and could watch the light change on the water as Halifax emerged from the haze across the harbor. There was, in these early years, something that resembled what the founders had imagined. The farm supplied most of the institution's food by the early 1870s. The patients who were well enough to work did work, in the kitchen, in the laundry, in the carpentry shop. There were small concerts on Sunday afternoons, attended by both staff and patients. The medical superintendent made a point of knowing the names of every patient in the institution. Visitors from other provinces came to study the model. Reports were sent to the Canadian and British medical press. There were papers written about outcomes, about recovery rates, about the architecture of therapeutic environments. Halifax watched from across the harbor and was satisfied with what it saw. But the world outside was changing faster than any institution could accommodate. By the mid-1870s, the patient population had grown beyond what the building had been designed to hold. The provincial government, looking for the most economical way to manage the increasing number of people with nowhere else to go, the old, the poor, the disabled, the addicted, the simply inconvenient, had discovered that the hospital was useful in ways that had nothing to do with moral therapy. The wards filled. The farm could no longer be purely therapeutic. It became something else. The patients who worked it were no longer healing through labor. They were providing labor. There is a difference, and everyone inside the building knew it, even if no one wrote it in the annual report. The beautiful view of Halifax from the upper windows did not change. But what that view represented, for the people standing at those windows, had already begun its long transformation. The original building had been designed to hold between 80 and 100 patients comfortably. By 1890, the Nova Scotia Hospital held more than 400. By 1910, that number was approaching 700. The province built additions. Wings were added to the original building, then buildings were added behind those wings, then structures were added behind those structures, until the hillside above the Dartmouth shore had become a small institutional city with a Victorian building at its center, almost buried now beneath the accumulated weight of what the province kept sending it. The patient population was no longer primarily people suffering from acute mental illness who might recover and return home. It was increasingly what the era called chronics, people who had been in the hospital for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. People who had arrived young and were now aging inside the institution. People who, over the course of their long commitment, had lost whatever connections to the outside world had once existed for them. Their families, in many cases, had stopped visiting. In some cases, their families had moved, or died, or simply let the connection atrophy over years of visits that went nowhere and felt like loss repeated. The original superintendent was gone. His successors faced a different institution than the one he had opened. Moral therapy had been designed for a manageable community. What they now managed was a population that the provincial government treated less like patients and more like inventory. Between 1890 and 1920, something fundamental changed in the way the province thought about the people inside the Nova Scotia Hospital. Moral therapy, which had always required adequate staffing and genuine investment to work, was quietly abandoned in practice, though it persisted in the language of annual reports and government speeches for decades afterward. What replaced it was custody. The goal was no longer to heal and return. The goal was to manage and contain. The difference did not appear in any official document, but it was present in every ward, every staffing decision, every budget allocation. At the same time, a new ideology was arriving from Europe and the United States that offered a scientific-sounding justification for what the province was already doing. It was called Eugenics. Its central argument was simple. Mental illness, poverty, and feeble-mindedness were hereditary conditions. The people displaying these conditions were, by their very nature, a threat to the health of the social body. The appropriate response was not treatment. It was segregation. Permanent removal from the reproductive population. It gave the province a framework, an intellectual architecture, for what it was already doing to the people in the Nova Scotia Hospital. It dressed institutional indifference in the language of science. It was respected. It was published in major journals. It was taught in medical schools. And it made the next 100 years considerably worse than the 100 years before. By the 1920s, the hospital's population had diversified in ways that the founding documents had never anticipated. Alongside those suffering from genuine psychiatric illness were veterans of the Great War who had come home altered in ways that no one had vocabulary for yet. They arrived with tremors, with nightmares, with the inability to perform the ordinary functions of civilian life. The province had no specialized care for them. It had the Nova Scotia Hospital, so it sent them there. There were women committed by husbands or fathers for reasons that ranged from genuine illness to insubordination. There were young people from Mi'kmaq communities who had arrived in provincial systems through pathways that bypassed meaningful consent, committed on the authority of Indian agents, or through welfare mechanisms that carried their own coercive weight. There were people who were poor, overwhelmingly poor. People for whom the hospital was not a psychiatric institution, but an alternative to starvation or destitution. and who were given no real choice in the matter. There were people who had been committed as teenagers for conditions classified as moral deficiency, a legal category that had no clinical basis and was applied almost exclusively to young women who had engaged in behavior their families or communities found shameful. The province called them all patients. The hospital called them all patients. The medical superintendent filed their paperwork in the same files as those who were genuinely, clinically, severely ill. The era of easy answers was over, and the Nova Scotia Hospital was about to discover that when an institution stops asking who should be there, it becomes something the founders would not have recognized, and would probably not have claimed. After 1920, no patient committed to the Nova Scotia Hospital had any legal mechanism by which they could independently challenge their own confinement. None. The physical transformation of the hospital was gradual, not a single dramatic gutting, but a slow accumulation of institutional decisions that each, individually, might have seemed reasonable, and together amounted to the erasure of everything the founding documents had promised. The farm, which had been designed as therapeutic, became by the 1930s effectively an agricultural enterprise, staffed entirely by unpaid patient labor. Patients who worked the farm received no compensation. Some received additional food or tobacco or small privileges. The farm generated revenue for the institution. The patients who worked it had not chosen to work it. They worked because the alternative was worse, and because no one, anywhere in the provincial system, had ever given them a mechanism to object. The chapel remained. The communal dining hall remained. The routines remained. But the routines no longer served the patients. The patients served the routines. Inside the wards, the distinction between therapeutic space and custodial space had evaporated entirely. Some wards operated with a single attendant, supervising 20, 30, 40 patients at once. There was not enough staff to provide anything resembling individual care. There was not enough space. There was not enough of anything. The provincial government knew this. The annual reports documented it in the careful language of professional concern that never quite named what was actually happening. People continued to arrive. The doors continued to receive them. Some came in crisis and were genuinely helped and went home. But many did not go home. Many became the permanent population, the chronics, the long-stay residents, the people who had arrived with ordinary problems and stayed until ordinary problems were the only life they had ever known. At the center of it all, from the late 1920s onward, was one man. He had arrived with impressive credentials. He had dangerous ideas dressed in the language of modern science. And he had the unconditional support of a provincial government that needed someone to manage the problem it had created. He had trained in Canada and abroad. He had published in the major psychiatric journals of the day. He had attended international conferences, where the most progressive thinkers in psychiatry gathered to share findings and debate methods. He was fluent in the emerging vocabulary of biological psychiatry, genetics, heredity, constitutional type, mental hygiene. He believed in science. He believed in progress. He believed, with the complete confidence of a man who had never been given reason to doubt himself, that he understood what the patients in the Nova Scotia Hospital were, what had made them that way, and what the institution's appropriate response to their condition should be. He held the confidence of the provincial medical establishment. He was consulted by government on questions of mental health policy. His reports to the legislature were received as authoritative. His judgments about who should be committed, and for how long, and under what conditions, were treated as final. He was, by any measure that the institution applied, the most trusted psychiatrist in provincial government circles. His patients were living 8 to a room. Some of them were working 12-hour days on a farm they could not leave. Some of them had not seen a family member in over a decade. Some of them had been committed as teenagers for reasons that no serious clinician today would recognize as psychiatric illness. He knew this. He documented it in the same files that recorded his credentials and his conference presentations. He believed that the distinction between patients who might recover and patients who never would was not a question of treatment. It was a question of type. In his framework, shared by a significant portion of the medical establishment of his era, mental illness was fundamentally a question of hereditary constitution. The patients in the long-stay wards were not there because they had received inadequate care, or because they had been committed for illegitimate reasons, or because the institution had failed them. They were there because their constitutions had placed them there. They were, in the language of the Eugenics movement that had fully penetrated North American psychiatry by the 1930s, the unfit, people whose presence in the general population represented a threat to social hygiene. This was not a fringe view. It was published in reputable journals. It was cited in government reports. It provided a coherent intellectual framework for why the hospital's population kept growing and why recovery rates kept declining. Not because anything was wrong with the institution, but because the patients themselves were constitutionally incapable of recovery. He believed he was a scientist. He believed he was doing what the science demanded. What the science demanded, in practice, was that he stop asking whether his patients could get better and start asking whether the province could be protected from them. In 1918, the federal government of Canada passed the Immigration Act with provisions specifically designed to exclude those deemed mentally defective from the country. The logic was consistent with what was being applied to citizens already inside the country. Mental illness, feeble-mindedness, and moral deviance were threats to the national body. They should be prevented from entering in where they already existed within the population, managed and contained. Nova Scotia had its own legislative architecture for this management. The Nova Scotia Hospitals Act gave medical superintendents authority that was, in practical terms, almost absolute. A physician's certificate, sometimes a single certificate from a single doctor, was sufficient to commit a person indefinitely. The standard for commitment was not dangerous to others, or even severely mentally ill. It was in need of care and treatment, a phrase broad enough to encompass virtually any behavior that a family, a physician, or a local authority found troubling. Once committed, a patient had no automatic right to review. No mechanism existed by which a patient could independently challenge their own confinement through a neutral process. Appeals required access to legal representation that most patients did not have and could not obtain. Families who wanted a patient released could request review, but the medical superintendent's judgment was typically treated as final. The provincial government funded the hospital through a per-patient allocation. More patients meant more funding. The financial architecture of the institution created a direct incentive to fill beds and keep them filled. Between 1920 and 1960, the Nova Scotia government contributed millions of dollars to the operation of an institution that it consistently underfunded relative to need, consistently failed to inspect with any meaningful rigor, and consistently described in public as a model of progressive psychiatric care. The medical superintendent had a framework. He had legislative authority. He had government funding. He had the full weight of the provincial state behind his clinical judgments. The patients trusted the institution that held them. Their families trusted the system that told them this was care. They had no idea what was being done to them, and no way to make it stop. The farm had been part of the original design. In the moral therapy model, work was healing, purposeful, restorative, a pathway back to the rhythms of ordinary life. By the 1930s, patient labor was the economic engine of the institution. It was not optional. Patients who were physically capable of working were assigned to work. The farm, the laundry, the kitchen, the maintenance of the buildings, the care of other patients, all of it was performed primarily by the patients themselves, under staff supervision. They received no wages. Some received small tokens, extra rations, tobacco, modest privileges. The value of their labor to the institution's operating budget was significant. The provincial government, in its annual reviews, was aware of this. It did not object. It noted the efficiencies. Patients who refused to work, or who were unable to maintain the pace required, faced consequences. Solitary confinement was a standard disciplinary tool. So was reduction of food allocation. So was transfer to the lower wards, where conditions were considerably worse, and where assignment itself functioned as punishment. Some patients worked the same fields, in the same routines, for 20 years, for 30 years. They knew the farm better than any staff member. They had contributed more to the institution's operation than any administrator could calculate. They had never been asked whether they consented to this arrangement. They were never paid. ECT arrived at the Nova Scotia Hospital in the 1940s, as it arrived at virtually every major psychiatric institution in North America during that decade. In its properly administered form, it was a legitimate and sometimes effective treatment for severe depression and certain other conditions, calibrated carefully, applied with specific protocols, monitored for adverse effects. What was used at the Nova Scotia Hospital, and what was documented in internal records and survivor accounts, diverged from that standard in ways that left permanent damage. ECT was applied to patients who had not been assessed for its appropriateness. It was applied to patients who could not meaningfully consent, because they had not been given enough information to consent, because their cognitive state made consent impossible, or because consent was simply not sought. It was applied as a method of management as much as treatment. Patients who were disruptive, who refused routines, who attempted to leave, who complained loudly or persistently about their conditions. These patients received ECT with a frequency that bore no relationship to any clinical indication. The files documented the applications. They did not document the therapeutic rationale because, in many cases, no therapeutic rationale existed. Survivors described the experience in consistent terms across decades. The disorientation that lasted for days, the memory loss that was sometimes temporary and sometimes permanent, the way the world came back wrong after a treatment and took weeks to reassemble itself. They described being afraid of the room. They described lying awake in the ward, listening to hear who was being taken there. The institution called this treatment. Some of the people who received it never recovered what they lost. The lower wards of the Nova Scotia Hospital, by the mid-20th century, operated on a logic that had no therapeutic basis. Patients assigned to these wards were kept behind locked doors continuously. There were no scheduled activities, no structured routines, no therapeutic programs. Staff-to-patient ratios in some wards were documented in internal reviews at levels that made individual care impossible. Not inadequate, but physically impossible. One attendant, 30 patients, a locked door, hours measured in silence and in sound. Some patients spent years in these wards without ever leaving the building. Some spent decades. The documentation is incomplete, in part because it was never the institution's practice to track outcomes for patients assigned to the lower wards with the same rigor applied to those in the treatment-oriented units. They had been classified as chronic. They were managed accordingly. Physical abuse was documented in internal reports. Attendants who struck patients, who used restraints punitively, who denied food or warmth or basic sanitation as disciplinary measures, these incidents appeared in inspection notes. In the cases where disciplinary action followed, it was almost universally administrative. A note in a file, a transfer to a different ward, occasionally a dismissal that came with no referral to the police, and no notification to the patient or their family. In no documented case, through the mid-20th century, was an attendant at the Nova Scotia Hospital criminally prosecuted for physical abuse of a patient. By the 1940s and 1950s, the composition of the hospital's population reflected the full range of people the provincial system had decided it had no better answer for. The genuinely ill were there. People suffering from schizophrenia, severe depression, bipolar disorder, conditions that the era's medicine was only beginning to understand. Some of them were being helped, within the limits of what the institution could offer. But they shared the wards with veterans whose primary diagnosis was what would now be recognized as PTSD, with elderly men and women whose primary condition was poverty and the absence of any family member willing to care for them, with young women whose primary offense against society had been an illegitimate pregnancy or a refusal to comply with a husband's demands. with Mi'kmaq individuals whose pathway into the institution had run through Indian affairs and welfare systems that carried their own coercions. These populations were classified under the same administrative categories. They received the same custodial management. The institution did not distinguish between them in its daily operations, only in its public reports to the provincial government, where the language remained consistently therapeutic and the numbers never reflected what the numbers actually meant. But numbers, even these numbers, can become abstract. Some of the people in those wards had names. Numbers, even horrifying numbers, can become abstract. So let us remember 3 names. Margaret Eaton was 22 years old in the autumn of 1911 when her father signed the commitment papers at the courthouse in Lunenburg County. She was not mentally ill. She was pregnant. She was unmarried. The father of her child was a man who would not be named in any official document. The classification written on Margaret's admission file was moral imbecility, a legal category that appeared in no serious clinical literature, but appeared in the Nova Scotia Hospitals Act and was sufficient to authorize indefinite confinement. Before she arrived at the Nova Scotia Hospital, Margaret had been a seamstress. She sewed for the families of Lunenburg. She could read and write. She wrote letters to friends, to her mother, to a cousin who had moved to Boston. Her family, after her commitment, did not write back for long. Inside, she was assigned to the women's ward and to the laundry. She worked the hospital laundry for the duration of her stay. She pressed the sheets used by the patients around her. She folded the uniforms worn by the attendants who supervised her. She did this for 31 years without pay. Her daughter, the child she had been carrying when she was committed, was given up and adopted. Margaret asked about her. The records suggest she asked repeatedly over years, at intervals, measured by the small notes that appear in her file. Patient requesting information about daughter, no action taken. Margaret Eaton died inside the Nova Scotia Hospital in 1942. She was 53 years old. She was buried in the hospital cemetery. Her grave marker was a numbered wooden stake. Her daughter, who spent decades looking for her, found the record of her death in the 1980s, 40 years after Margaret died, through a provincial archives request. There was no death notice. There had been no family notification. There was no apology. Joseph Bernard was 34 years old in 1936 when he was committed to the Nova Scotia Hospital on the authority of an Indian agent acting under the Indian Act. Joseph was Mi'kmaq. He had grown up on the Millbrook Reserve outside Truro and had spent much of his adult life working seasonal labor, fishing, logging, whatever was available. He was documented by the Indian agent as unmanageable and a danger to the reserve community. The specific behaviors cited were his refusal to comply with the agent's authority and his insistence at a public meeting that the federal government had violated treaty obligations. He had been drinking on the evening he was reported. This detail appeared prominently in the commitment paperwork. The political context did not appear at all. Joseph's admission file noted his race. It noted his occupation. It noted the agent's report. It did not note that Joseph had no prior psychiatric history. It did not note that no physician had examined him prior to commitment. He was placed in a general ward. He was assigned to the farm. He was given no treatment plan, because no clinical condition had been diagnosed beyond the agent's administrative determination. He remained in the Nova Scotia Hospital for 12 years. He was released in 1948, not because his condition had improved, no condition had been established, but because a new medical superintendent had conducted a review of long-stay patients and determined that Joseph no longer presented a management concern. He was released with no documentation, no follow-up support, and no acknowledgement that his 12 years of confinement had been without legitimate clinical basis. He returned to the Millbrook community. He never spoke publicly about what had happened to him inside. His granddaughter spoke about it once to a provincial inquiry in the 1990s. No investigation was ever opened. The Indian agent who signed the commitment papers had been dead for 20 years by the time anyone asked the question out loud. Ruth Connors walked through the front door of the Nova Scotia Hospital in February of 1953. She was 19 years old. She had been brought there by her mother and the family physician, who had determined, after a series of office visits, that Ruth was suffering from a condition he documented as emotional instability with immoral tendencies. Ruth was gay. She had told her mother this 3 months earlier. Her mother had taken her to the physician. The physician had referred her to the hospital. Ruth was assigned to the women's ward. She received ECT. The records document 14 treatments over the course of 4 months. The clinical notation for each session describes the patient as calmer following treatment. Ruth's own description, given decades later in an interview with a researcher at Dalhousie University, was different. She described the treatments as feeling like something had been taken from her, something she had known how to feel that she could no longer quite reach after the treatments. She described it as a kind of emotional absence. She said, "It worked, I suppose, in the way they meant it to. I stopped being myself. I didn't know who else to be." She was discharged after 5 months. Once the family physician confirmed she was no longer exhibiting the original behaviors that had prompted admission. She was 20 years old. She had no clinical diagnosis. She had received 14 electroconvulsive treatments for the condition of being who she was. Ruth Connors lived a long life. She had a partner for 38 years. She raised 2 adopted children. She spent the last decade of her life in quiet advocacy for survivors of institutional psychiatry in Nova Scotia. Not loudly, not publicly, but consistently. Writing letters, signing petitions, attending hearings that mostly didn't change anything, attending them anyway. She died in 2014. She never received an apology from the province of Nova Scotia. In 2022, the Nova Scotia government issued a formal apology for the harms experienced by LGBTQ+ individuals through the provincial health and justice systems. The apology did not name the Nova Scotia Hospital. These 3 stories represent hundreds more, conservatively, hundreds. Many did not come forward. Some carried shame that the institution had deliberately installed in them. Some were too cognitively damaged by what they had experienced to navigate the bureaucratic process of a claim. Some died before the truth began to emerge. Their children found the records. Sometimes their grandchildren found the records. They deserve to be named. They deserve to be counted. The province of Nova Scotia prefers a different accounting. In 1955, a provincial government inspector submitted a confidential report to the Department of Public Health in Halifax. The report was specific. It documented patients who had been confined to locked wards for periods of 20, 30 years, longer, with no current assessment, no active treatment, and no legal review of their status. It documented ward conditions that were, in the inspector's own language, inconsistent with basic standards of human habitation. It documented patient labor practices that raised questions of consent and compensation. It documented attendant behavior toward patients that fell outside any defensible interpretation of therapeutic care. The report was addressed to the deputy minister. It was marked for internal review. It was not released publicly. No patient was informed of its findings. No family was notified. No external investigation was commissioned. What happened instead was a series of administrative meetings. Some improvements were made. Additional staffing in specific wards, a review of certain admission procedures, the establishment of new documentation requirements. The changes were incremental and partial. They were presented in subsequent annual reports to the legislature as evidence of the province's commitment to ongoing improvement. The word cover-up implies a decision, a moment, a person who gave an order. What happened at the Nova Scotia Hospital was something more ordinary and more durable than that. It was the accumulated decisions of a provincial government over many decades to keep asking how little it could do rather than how much was needed. No single person destroyed the files. No single person gave the order to look away. They simply kept not looking, and kept not looking, and kept not looking. The medical superintendent, who received the 1955 report, did not resign. He did not issue any statement. He wrote a response to the deputy minister, noting several of the improvements already underway and expressing confidence in the institution's direction. He retired years later with a formal commendation from the provincial government acknowledging his long service to the mental health of Nova Scotians. The first sustained public reckoning with the Nova Scotia Hospital's history did not come from inside the institution. It did not come from the provincial government. It came from survivors, from families, from researchers, and from the slow and accumulating pressure of people who refused to let their own experience of the institution go unacknowledged. By the 1980s and 1990s, a number of former patients had begun speaking publicly. Some spoke to journalists. Some spoke to researchers. Some submitted testimony to provincial review processes. What they described, consistently, across people who had been inside the hospital in different decades and under different circumstances, was an institution whose operating reality had long since diverged from its public description. They described the labor, the treatments, the locked wards, the attendance, the years without visits, the sense, expressed in different words by different people, of having been not just treated, but erased, of having entered the building as a person with a name and a history, and left, or never left, as a file, a number, a management unit, in an institutional system that had no serious interest in their recovery. In 1987, a documentary produced for provincial television included testimony from former patients and their families. It was the first time many Nova Scotians heard this version of the institution's history directly, in the words of people who had experienced it. The provincial government responded with language of acknowledgement and commitment to improvement. It did not commission an independent investigation. Through the 1990s and 2000s, a series of reviews, studies, and formal processes addressed aspects of what had happened at the Nova Scotia Hospital and within the provincial psychiatric system more broadly. A review of admission practices produced recommendations for reform. A separate process addressed the experiences of Indigenous patients within the mental health system. A review of ECT use produced a set of updated guidelines. Each of these processes found what the 1955 inspection report had found, and what the survivors had been saying, that the institution had caused serious harm to a significant number of people who had been placed in its care, and that the harm had been enabled by a provincial system that had prioritized cost management and administrative convenience over the well-being of the patients it claimed to serve. The reviews were received and filed. Some recommendations were implemented, some were not. For the survivors who sought formal acknowledgement, the provincial government's response followed a consistent pattern. Those who received any form of official response received it through processes that were slow, opaque, and consistently designed to minimize the province's liability rather than to acknowledge the full scope of what had happened. Where settlements were paid, they were accompanied by conditions. Where acknowledgement was offered, it was circumscribed. Specific harms, specific periods, specific individuals, carefully delineated in ways that avoided establishing any broader admission of systemic failure. Some survivors signed agreements, some did not, and continued to pursue acknowledgement through other means, with limited success. Some died during the process. In 2022, the provincial government's apology to LGBTQ+ Nova Scotians acknowledged harms within the mental health system. It did not name the Nova Scotia Hospital specifically. It did not include a compensation mechanism. It did not acknowledge the number of people affected. The survivors who were still living were invited to attend the announcement. Some of them went. Some of them sat in the audience and listened to the apology, and then waited for someone to say their name. No one said their name. The Nova Scotia Hospital was not unique. It was not exceptional. It was a model, and other institutions were built on the same logic, with the same tools, for the same purposes. The story of the Nova Scotia Hospital is not the story of one bad institution in one province that lost its way. The same legislative frameworks that enabled indefinite commitment without meaningful review existed across every province in Canada. The same financial structures that rewarded high patient populations and minimized recovery outcomes operated in Ontario, in Quebec, in British Columbia. The same ideologies, moral therapy abandoned in favor of custodial management, eugenics providing scientific cover for the warehousing of the unfit, shaped institutions from Halifax to Victoria, The Huronia Regional Centre in Ontario housed over 2,000 people, classified as mentally retarded, many of whom had intellectual disabilities that, with appropriate support, would never have prevented them from living in their communities. Former residents and their families launched a class action lawsuit in 2009. An Ontario court found that the province had breached its duty of care. The government apologized in 2013. A monument now stands at the site. It is not enough. The Grandview Training School for Girls in Ontario confined young women through a system of abuse documented in survivors' testimony and confirmed in a provincial inquiry. The Provincial Training School in Portage la Prairie, Manitoba. The Brandon Mental Health Center. These institutions operated on the same logic as the Nova Scotia Hospital, funded by the same kind of government, protected by the same kind of indifference. This was not a Canadian failure. This was a particular Canadian pattern. The deployment of institutional care as a mechanism for social control, the use of medical authority to launder decisions that were fundamentally political, and the consistent, generational failure to hold anyone accountable when those decisions caused harm. For Mi'kmaq people and other First Nations individuals in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada, the institutional system, including the Nova Scotia Hospital, represented one layer of a larger architecture of dispossession that included residential schools, child welfare systems, and the active, federally administered suppression of Indigenous political and cultural life. The pathways through which Indigenous people arrived in the provincial psychiatric system were often not clinical. They ran through Indian affairs, through welfare systems, through policing practices that applied different standards to reserves and urban Indigenous communities. The intersection of colonial governance and psychiatric authority created a particular vulnerability, one that the Nova Scotia Hospital was not designed to address, because the people it harmed in this intersection were not considered, by the systems that built it, to be its primary concern. The full accounting of what happened to Indigenous people within the Nova Scotia Hospital's history has not been completed. The records are incomplete. Access is limited. Some of the relevant files were not kept. Some were not kept well. Some of what happened is known only through the testimony of families, passed down through generations, waiting for a formal process that has not yet arrived. That accounting is still owed. The Nova Scotia Hospital still stands at 300 Pleasant Street in Dartmouth. It still stands on the same hillside above the same harbor. The original Victorian structure, built in 1858, is still present at the core, though it is now surrounded and partially obscured by more than a century of institutional additions, newer wings, support buildings, service structures that have accumulated around the original building, like institutional sediment. The harbor view is still there. From certain windows, on certain floors, Halifax is still visible across the water on a clear morning. The city is still there. It is still close. The hospital still operates today as a psychiatric facility within Nova Scotia Health, providing acute psychiatric care, long-term care, and forensic mental health services for the province. It serves a genuine clinical function. The staff who work there now are, by any reasonable account, working within a completely different framework than the one that operated in the mid-20th century. The patient cemetery still exists on the grounds. It contains the remains of hundreds of people who died inside the institution over more than 150 years. Some of the graves have been identified through genealogical research by families. Many have not. The markers, where markers exist, are not always accurate. The records are incomplete. There is no public memorial on the grounds listing the names of those buried there. There is no plaque on the main building explaining what happened inside. There is no permanent exhibition in the hospital's public spaces, acknowledging the wrongful commitments, the patient labor, the abuses documented in the institution's own records. The institution acknowledges its history in the way that institutions acknowledge histories, carefully, selectively, and in language calibrated to contain rather than illuminate. The harbor view from the upper windows is exactly what it was in 1858. What it represents has changed entirely. There are two Nova Scotia hospitals, two distinct versions of the same building, separated not by geography, but by the gap between what the institution said it was and what it actually did. The first Nova Scotia Hospital was built from genuine conviction. The reformers who argued for its creation, the politicians who voted for it, the physicians who designed its first routines, the people who carried Dorothea Dix's arguments into the Nova Scotia legislature and convinced a colonial government to build something better than a jail, believed what they were saying. They wanted a place where the mentally ill could be treated with dignity and return to their lives. The founding institution was imperfect, constrained by limited resources and the limits of the era's medicine. But it was, in its origins, a project of compassion. The second Nova Scotia Hospital was the institution that existed from roughly the 1920s through the latter decades of the 20th century. Not a therapeutic community, but a custodial system, funded by a government that had decided the cheapest solution to poverty, deviance, and inconvenience was permanent removal, staffed by people whose authority had no meaningful check, populated by thousands of human beings who had been placed there with inadequate justification and held there without adequate review. The worst the first hospital did was fail to heal everyone it tried to help. The worst the second hospital did was take people who had never needed to be there, or who had needed help and received harm instead, and convert them, over years, into permanent residents of a world with no exit and no advocate. Both hospitals had the same address. Both had the same harbor view. Both called what they did care. The unanswered questions remain. How many people were wrongly committed to the Nova Scotia Hospital over its history? The number is unknown. The records are incomplete, inconsistently kept, and in some cases sealed. The province has not commissioned an independent review with a mandate to find out. How many of the graves in the hospital cemetery belong to people who had been committed for reasons that no clinical standard would have supported? No one has counted. What happened to the Mi'kmaq individuals committed through Indian Affairs channels? Their experience has been partially documented and partially acknowledged, and has not been fully reckoned with. What will it take for the province of Nova Scotia to say, in explicit and permanent terms, not in the language of general apology, but in the language of specific acknowledgement, what was done, to whom, by whom, for how long, and at whose direction? What happens to the patients buried in unmarked, numbered graves in the hospital cemetery, the people like Margaret Eaton, who entered with a name and left with a number, if no institution with the authority to name them chooses to do so? These questions have been asked before. They have been received, filed, and partially answered. The partial answers are insufficient. The harbor is still there. From the upper windows of the Nova Scotia Hospital, Halifax is still visible on clear mornings. The same city, the same water, the same distance. The light still comes in through the same eastern windows that the architects designed in 1858 to give the patients something to hope for. They believed the view would inspire. They believed it would remind the people inside that the world was still out there and still reachable. For hundreds of people over the past century and a half, that view was the last thing they ever saw of the world outside. Not because they were too ill to leave, because the institution decided they wouldn't, because the province decided it was easier, because no one, no inspector, no politician, no physician, ever asked whether the cost of keeping them there was a cost the patients should be paying. The harbor is still beautiful. Halifax is still close. The water still catches the morning light. For the people who deserved to cross it and never did, the water will never quite look the same again. The Nova Scotia Hospital still stands. The cemetery is still unmarked. And somewhere in the provincial archives, filed under categories that were designed to make them hard to find, are the names of every person who looked at that harbor and waited.